August 25, 1941, in the ancient city of Tehran. It is 4 a.m., and the cool mountain air over the Alborz range is suddenly torn apart by the low, guttural hum of Soviet bombers and the distant thunder of British naval guns off the coast of the Persian Gulf. For the people of Iran, this was the moment their world changed, as two of the world's greatest powers descended upon their borders simultaneously. To understand why this happened, we must look at the desperate state of the world in the summer of 1941. The global conflict had reached its most feverish pitch. Only 2 months earlier, Nazi Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive, brutal invasion of the Soviet Union. By August, the Red Army was in a disastrous retreat, losing hundreds of thousands of men and vast swaths of territory. Joseph Stalin was desperate for supplies, tanks, and planes to stay in the fight. Winston Churchill, thousands of miles away in London, knew that if the Soviet Union collapsed, the full weight of the Nazi war machine would turn back toward Britain. The survival of the Western world rested on keeping Russia in the war. But there was a logistical nightmare. The Arctic convoys were being decimated by U-boats, and the Pacific routes were too long and vulnerable. The eyes of the world turned toward a map of the Middle East, specifically toward Iran. This was a nation that sat at the ultimate crossroads of history. To the south, the British held the oil-rich fields of Iraq and the vital refineries of Abadan. To the north, the Soviet Union stretched across the horizon. Running right through the middle was the Trans-Iranian Railway, a newly completed engineering marvel that connected the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. It was the perfect backdoor to provide the Red Army with the weapons it needed to survive. Iran, however, had declared its neutrality at the start of the war. Reza Shah Pahlavi, the iron-willed monarch of the nation, had spent decades trying to modernize his country and steer it away from the influence of both the British and the Russians. In his eyes, Iran was a sovereign state that owed nothing to the warring factions of Europe. But neutrality is often a luxury that the powerful do not grant to the strategically placed. The Shah had also allowed thousands of German technicians and advisors into the country to help with industrial projects. To the Allies, these were not just engineers, they were a fifth column of Nazi spies waiting for the signal to sabotage the oil fields or blow up the railway. By mid-August, the diplomatic pressure reached its breaking point. The British and the Soviets issued joint demands for Iran to expel all German nationals immediately. Reza Shah, sensing the encroachment on his sovereignty, hesitated. He believed that the Allies would not dare to violate his borders while he maintained a strict policy of non-alignment. He was wrong. The stakes were simply too high. For Churchill, the oil at Abadan was the lifeblood of the Royal Navy. For Stalin, the Iranian railway was a lifeline for his dying infantry. On August 17th, another ultimatum was delivered, but the Iranian response was deemed insufficient. The decision was made. The neutrality of a nation would be sacrificed for the security of the globe. As the sun began to rise on that fateful August morning, the invasion, code-named Operation Countenance, was already in full swing. It was a pincer movement of overwhelming force. From the north, Soviet divisions poured across the border into Azerbaijan and Khorasan. From the south and west, British and Indian troops landed at the port of Bandar Shahpur and moved toward the oil refineries. The Iranian military, though brave, was no match for the combined might of two empires. Ships were sunk in their harbors before they could even weigh anchor, and airfields were pulverized before pilots could reach their cockpits. This moment in history serves as a haunting reminder of how the grand strategies of superpowers often trample the sovereignty of smaller nations. The invasion of Iran was technically a violation of international law, an act of aggression against a neutral state. Yet, in the eyes of the Allies, it was a necessary evil, a move that secured the bridge of victory through which millions of tons of American and British supplies would eventually flow to the Eastern Front. This supply line arguably saved the Soviet Union from collapse and turned the tide of the entire war. But for Iran, the legacy was far more complex. The occupation brought about the forced abdication of Reza Shah, ushered in years of foreign presence, and sowed the seeds of a deep-seated resentment toward Western intervention that would simmer for decades. It stands as a poignant example of the tragedy of the Great Game, where the borders of a nation become nothing more than lines on a map for generals and prime ministers. In the pursuit of saving the world from one tyranny, the Allies became the occupiers of another, leaving a mark on the Iranian soul that history has never truly erased. June 22, 1941, London. As news of the German invasion of the Soviet Union filtered through the halls of Whitehall, a new and terrifying reality set in for the British High Command. The war had just expanded to a scale previously unimaginable, and the survival of the British Empire now rested on two critical pillars: the endurance of the Red Army and the uninterrupted flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had been the lifeblood of the Royal Navy, and the refinery at Abadan stood as the largest facility of its kind in the world. To the British, this was not just a commercial interest, but a vital organ of the state. If the swastika were to fly over the oil fields of Iran, the British war machine would grind to a halt within months. The nightmare scenario in the minds of the British cabinet was a pincer movement of German forces, with one arm swinging through North Africa toward the Suez Canal, and the other sweeping down from a defeated Russia into the heart of the Middle East. In the streets of Tehran, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Reza Shah Pahlavi had spent years trying to navigate the treacherous waters of neutrality. But his leanings were no secret. Seeking to modernize his nation without falling under the total control of the British or the Soviets, the Shah had turned to German engineers, technicians, and advisors. By 1941, over 600 German nationals held key positions within the Iranian infrastructure, managing everything from the railways to the telecommunications systems. To the Shah, these were essential workers helping to drag Iran into the 20th century. To the British intelligence service, they were a fifth column of saboteurs and spies, waiting for the signal from Berlin to seize the oil fields and destroy the refineries. The British feared that at any moment, these specialists could turn their tools into weapons, paralyzing the very resources the Allies needed to survive. The urgency reached a fever pitch as the German army raced across the Russian steppes during the height of the summer. By late July, the British and Soviets began a coordinated diplomatic offensive, demanding that the Shah expel all German nationals immediately. The Shah, a man of fierce pride who viewed his country's sovereignty as absolute, refused to be bullied. He insisted that the Germans were under strict surveillance and that his neutrality remained intact. But in the eyes of London and Moscow, neutrality was a luxury that the world could no longer afford. The strategic map of the world had changed. Iran was no longer just a sovereign nation. It was the bridge to victory, the only viable route through which the British and Americans could the millions of tons of supplies needed to keep the Soviet Union in the fight. As the clock ticked toward a confrontation, the British military prepared for the unthinkable. They could not risk the possibility that the Shah might invite the Wehrmacht into the country, or that his army might offer the Germans a base of operations. At 4 a.m., on August 25, 1941, the silence of the Iranian dawn was shattered by the roar of engines and the whistle of falling bombs. The invasion was a masterclass in cold geopolitical necessity. It was an act of preemption, fueled by a paranoid yet grounded fear that the oil of the East was the ultimate prize for Hitler's quest for global hegemony. The British and Soviets brushed aside the Iranian military in a matter of days, proving that when the survival of empires is at stake, the borders of smaller nations are little more than lines on a map to be redrawn or ignored at will. Looking back at those frantic months of 1941, we see a world where the moral clarity of fighting fascism was often clouded by the ruthless demands of survival. The British fear of Nazi influence in Iran was not entirely unfounded, but the cost of addressing that fear was the systematic dismantling of a nation's independence. This moment in history serves as a haunting reminder that in the grand theater of global conflict, the pursuit of a greater good often requires the sacrifice of a smaller one. The legacy of this intervention is a complicated tapestry of resentment and strategic triumph. It saved the Allied cause by securing the oil and the supply lines, but it also left an indelible scar on the Iranian consciousness. It taught the world that the black gold beneath the desert sands is both a source of immense power and a magnet for foreign intervention, a curse and a blessing that continues to shape the destiny of the Middle East to this very day. The tragedy remains that in the effort to extinguish the shadow of the swastika, the liberators themselves became the occupiers, and the price of that victory is still being calculated by the generations that followed. September 25, 1941, in the humid docks of Khorramshahr, the transformation of Iran from a sovereign nation into a logistical gears and cogs machine began in earnest. While the world watched the brutal German advance toward Moscow, a quieter but equally vital battle was being waged along the dusty tracks of the Trans-Iranian Railway. The occupation had secured the oil, but the strategic necessity of the hour was far more desperate. The Soviet Union was bleeding out, and the Arctic convoys through the freezing U-boat-infested waters of the Barents Sea were becoming a graveyard for Allied sailors and their precious cargo. A safer, more consistent artery was needed to pump the lifeblood of Lend-Lease supplies into the Soviet heartland, and Iran was the only viable path left to the Allies. The challenge facing the occupying forces was staggering. The Trans-Iranian Railway, though a proud achievement of the recently deposed Shah, was a single-track line designed for modest domestic trade, not the gargantuan requirements of total war. It climbed through the jagged, unforgiving Zagros mountains and descended into the burning plains of the south, crossing thousands of bridges and hundreds of tunnels that were never meant to handle the weight of heavy tanks. To make this a viable lifeline, the Allies had to rebuild an entire nation's infrastructure under the crushing pressure of a ticking clock. By 4 p.m., on any given day in 1942, the ports along the Persian Gulf were a chaotic symphony of cranes and shouting men, as crates of disassembled Douglas A-20 Havocs and thousands of tons of canned food were winched onto the docks. The Americans arrived in force in late 1942 to take over the logistical heavy lifting, establishing the Persian Gulf Command. This was a monumental feat of engineering and human sweat. They built truck assembly plants in the middle of the desert where Iranian workers and Allied soldiers put together thousands of Studebaker trucks. These vehicles became the backbone of the Red Army, providing the mobility that would eventually allow the Soviet forces to pursue the Wehrmacht all the way to Berlin. From the ports of Bandar Shahpur and Khorramshahr, a constant stream of steel and gunpowder flowed northward. At 11 a.m., each morning, convoys of hundreds of trucks would depart, embarking on a grueling journey over mountain passes that reached 10,000 feet in elevation, where the suffocating heat of the desert gave way to sub-zero alpine blizzards in a matter of hours. But this bridge to victory was built on the backs of the Iranian people, and the cost was paid in their hunger. The Allies prioritized the movement of war materiel over everything else. The railway, once the primary carrier of grain and coal for the Iranian populace, was now almost exclusively dedicated to the Red Army. Food supplies in Tehran and other major cities began to vanish as the transport system was diverted to the war effort. Inflation skyrocketed as the Allied presence flooded the local economy with currency while simultaneously stripping the markets of goods. By 3 p.m. on a typical afternoon in late 1942, bread lines in the capital stretched for city blocks, and the desperation often boiled over into violent riots. The very supplies passing through their land to save the world from fascism were, in a bitter irony, starving the people who lived along the route. As the war progressed, the numbers became truly staggering. Over 5 million tons of supplies were funneled through the Persian Corridor. It was not just tanks and planes. It was the mundane necessities of survival: telephone wire, rubber, boots, surgical instruments, and millions of tons of wheat. Without this corridor, the massive Soviet counteroffensives of 1943 and 1944 might have lacked the mechanical stamina required to break the back of the German army. The Studebaker truck became as iconic to the Soviet soldier as the T-34 tank, and almost all of them began their journey on the dusty, winding roads of Iran. The legacy of the Persian Corridor is one of deep, unsettling complexity. It remains a triumph of international cooperation, a moment when the disparate ideologies of the capitalist West and the communist East converged to achieve the impossible. Yet for Iran, it remains a period of profound violation and systemic neglect. The corridor proved that the world's great powers would not hesitate to bypass the sovereignty of a smaller nation if the stakes were high enough. It established a precedent for the Cold War, turning Iran into a chessboard for intelligence agencies and political maneuvering long after the last truck had left the mountain passes. The tragedy of the lifeline is that while it helped save the world from a dark tyranny, it left the host nation scarred and forgotten in the triumph of the victors. We must remember that the victory in Europe was not just won on the front lines of Stalingrad or the beaches of Normandy, but also in the quiet, desperate labor of those who worked the docks and rails of a country they never chose to sacrifice. The Persian Corridor stands as a testament to the fact that in the theater of war, even the most vital bridge is often built upon the silent sacrifices of the innocent, leaving behind a history where the price of global survival was the sovereign dignity of a people. August 25, 1941, at 40:10, 1941, at 40:10 a.m. Along the Shatt al-Arab waterway, the silence of the desert night was shattered by the rhythmic thumping of naval guns. While the world's attention was fixed on the titanic struggle between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army on the plains of Russia, a new front was opening in the ancient heart of the Middle East. This was Operation Countenance, a coordinated pincer movement designed to crush Iranian neutrality and secure the vital oil fields and transit routes the Allies so desperately needed. In the south, British and Indian forces launched a multi-pronged assault from Iraq and the Persian Gulf. To the north, 3 Soviet armies, backed by over 1,000 tanks and hundreds of aircraft, surged across the border from the Caucasus. For the Iranian soldiers stationed at the frontier, there had been no formal declaration of war. They woke to the sound of explosions and the sight of massive armored columns silhouettes against the rising sun. At the port of Khorram Shah, the Iranian Navy attempted a spirited but lopsided defense. The sloop Babur was blindsided by the HMS Shoreham, while the Iranian Admiral Bayandor was killed in the opening hours of the engagement while trying to organize a shore battery. By 8 a.m., the British had secured the Abadan refinery, the largest in the world, ensuring that the fuel for the Royal Navy would not fall into hostile hands or be sabotaged by German sympathizers. Meanwhile, in the rugged mountains of the north, the Soviet juggernaut moved with terrifying speed. Red Army paratroopers dropped behind Iranian lines, while their fighters strafed airfields and dropped propaganda leaflets over Tehran. The Iranian military, though modernized by Reza Shah, was in no position to fight a two-front war against the British Empire and the Soviet Union simultaneously. Communication lines were severed, and the central command in Tehran fell into a state of paralyzed confusion. By the second day of the invasion, the strategic reality had become undeniable. The Iranian Air Force was virtually non-existent. Its small fleet of British-made biplanes destroyed on the ground or shot out of the sky within hours. British armor pushed toward the Pai-Tak Pass, where a small contingent of Iranian troops held their ground with bolt-action rifles against the might of the 10th Indian Infantry Division. These men were not fighting for a global ideology, they were fighting for the soil of their ancestors. Yet bravery could not bridge the gap in technology and numbers. By August 28, the Iranian government ordered a ceasefire, but the advance did not stop. The Allies were not just looking for a sewer, they were looking for a total occupation to guarantee the security of the Trans-Iranian Railway. The military reality of Operation Countenance was characterized by a cold, surgical efficiency. The British and Soviets met at Qazvin, effectively cutting the country in half. Reza Shah, the man who had spent decades trying to forge a modern, independent Iran, found himself a prisoner in his own palace, eventually forced to abdicate in favor of his son. The invasion was justified by the Allies as a necessary precaution against German fifth columnists, but the sheer scale of the military force used suggested a deeper, more permanent objective. They needed a land bridge to keep the Soviet Union in the war, and Iran was the only viable path. As the smoke cleared and the foreign tanks rumbled through the streets of Tehran, the military operation transitioned into a grueling occupation. The legacy of those 3 days in August remains a complex and painful chapter in the history of the 20th century. While Operation Countenance succeeded in creating the bridge to victory that would eventually fuel the Soviet counterattacks at Stalingrad, it did so by trampling the sovereignty of a nation that had tried to remain apart from the global slaughter. We are left to reflect on the brutal calculus of total war, where the survival of the many is purchased at the cost of the freedom of the few. The silence that returned to the Iranian desert was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, muffled quiet of a nation under watch, serving as a reminder that in the grand strategy of empires, even the most ancient civilizations can be reduced to mere lines on a supply map. It is a poignant testament to the fact that the path to a better world is often paved with the broken promises of neutrality and the quiet, yearning grief of those caught in the gears of history. September 16, 1941, in the heart of Tehran. The morning air was thick with the dust of moving convoys and the palpable tension of a city awaiting its fate. The Iranian resistance had lasted barely 80 hours before the reality of overwhelming force crushed the dream of armed neutrality. For Reza Shah Pahlavi, the man who had spent 2 decades forging a modern Iranian state out of the ruins of the Qajar dynasty, the world was shrinking to the dimensions of his private study. The British and Soviets were no longer just at the borders. They were the new masters of his domain, and their patience had reached its absolute limit. By 10 a.m., the monarch realized that his time had finally run out. The demands from London and Moscow were clear and uncompromising: the immediate expulsion of German nationals and his own removal from the throne. To the Allied powers, he was a liability, a potential sympathizer to the Axis, or at the very least, an obstacle to the total control of the Trans-Iranian railway. This railway, the pride of the Shah's reign and a symbol of Iranian modernization, was now the lifeblood of the Soviet war effort. It was the Persian Corridor, a steel artery through which the industrial might of the United States and Britain would flow to the desperate defers of Moscow and Stalingrad. As the clock struck 1 p.m., Reza Shah signed the instrument of abdication. It was a brief, bitter document that signaled the Yavin era. He handed the crown to his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, hoping that a younger, more malleable face might appease the invaders and preserve the Pahlavi line. The elder Shah left the capital not in a triumphal procession, but as a prisoner of circumstance, driven toward the coast and eventually into exile on the island of Mauritius and later South Africa. He would never see his homeland again. Behind him, the Iranian army, the force he had built with such pride and nationalistic fervor, was ordered to stand down. Their rifles were stacked, and their barracks were occupied by foreign soldiers who spoke languages the local conscripts could not understand. The occupation was not a liberation. It was a cold, calculated seizure of a strategic crossroad. By 4:30 p.c., May, that afternoon, Soviet troops were patrolling the northern districts while British forces secured the oil fields in the southern ports. The Iranian people, caught between the hammer of the Kremlin and the anvil of Whitehall, watched as their food supplies were requisitioned and their sovereignty became a hollow word. Inflation soared as the foreign armies flooded the economy with new currency, and the shadow of famine began to loom over the plateau, a direct consequence of the massive logistics operation now feeding the Red Army instead of the Iranian citizenry. The fall of Reza Shah was more than just the one man's reign. It was the moment Iran was forced onto the global stage as a pawn in a game it never asked to play. The occupation secured the Lend-Lease route, arguably saving the Soviet Union from collapse. But the price was paid in Persian pride and internal stability. The young Shah, who took his oath at the Majlis that afternoon, would rule for decades under the heavy influence of the West, a legacy of dependency that would eventually ignite the fires of future revolution. History often remembers the grand victories of the Second World War as clean triumphs of good over evil, yet the dust of Tehran tells a more complicated story. It is a story of how a monarch's ambition for independence was broken by the frantic needs of a world at war. The abdication of Reza Shah remains a haunting reminder that in the theater of global conflict, the sovereignty of a nation is often the first casualty of strategic necessity. we are left to reflect on the silent cost of the Persian Corridor, where the survival of the many was bought with the dignity of the few, leaving a scar on the Iranian soul that would take generations to even begin to heal. The silence that fell over the marble palace was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of a nation whose destiny had been rewritten by foreign pens, leaving a legacy of resentment that would echo far beyond the battlefields of Europe. In the grand strategy of empires, Iran was a bridge to victory, but for the Iranians, it was the site of a profound and lasting loss of self-determination. January 1946, Tehran. The promise made under the flickering shadows of 1941 had reached its day of reckoning, but the horizon was far from clear. When the British and Soviets had first crossed the borders, they spoke of temporary necessity in the defense of global liberty. They pledged that within 6 months of the wars, the last foreign soldier would depart, leaving Iran to its own devices. Yet, as the clock struck 3 p.m., on the deadline day, the Soviet Red Army remained firmly entrenched in the north, showing no signs of relinquishing the territory it had seized under the guise of wartime cooperation. This was the moment the mask of the Grand Alliance finally slipped, revealing the cold, hard features of the geopolitical struggle that would define the next half-century. The invasion of Iran is often relegated to a footnote in the grand histories of the Second World War, remembered primarily as a logistical triumph that paved the way for the Soviet victory at Stalingrad. We celebrate the millions of tons of American steel, food, and fuel that moved along the Persian Corridor, but we rarely pause to consider the price paid by those who lived along its path. To the Allies, Iran was a map, a series of supply lines, and a strategic buffer. To the Iranians, it was a home that had been violated, a neutral state whose sovereignty was traded for the convenience of empires. The bread riots of 17 December 1942, which erupted at 11 a.m. in the heart of Tehran, were a visceral cry from a population starving while their grain was diverted to feed foreign armies. It was a bitter irony that the very nations fighting to liberate Europe from tyranny were overseeing a period of hunger and political suppression in the Middle East. As the sun set on the colonial era, the Iranian crisis of 1946 became the first true battlefield of the Cold War. It was here, in the dispute over Soviet-backed separatist movements in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, that the newly formed United Nations faced its first major test. The world watched as the young Shah and his government navigated a treacherous path between a departing Britain and an encroaching Soviet Union, all while a rising United States began to cast its own long shadow over the region. The betrayal of the 1941 promises left a scar on the Iranian national consciousness that could not be bandaged by diplomatic platitudes. It fostered a deep-seated suspicion of foreign intervention that would fester for decades, shaping the political landscape of the Middle East in ways the strategists in London and Moscow could never have predicted. When we look back at the occupation, we see more than just a logistical feat. We see the erosion of a nation's dignity. The deposition of Reza Shah and the installation of his son were not mere administrative changes. They were the actions of masters treating a sovereign state like a puppet theater. This interference set a precedent for the 1953 coup and the eventual explosive rejection of Western influence in 1979. The bridge to victory for the Allies was, for Iran, a bridge to a future defined by trauma and a desperate, sometimes violent, search for self-determination. The legacy of the Persian Corridor is one of fundamental contradiction. It is the story of how the world was saved at the expense of a nation that never asked to be part of the fight. History often remembers the winners and the losers, but it frequently forgets the bystanders who were trampled in the rush toward the finish line. Iran was never a combatant, yet it bore the burdens of a frontline state. The quiet that eventually returned to the Zagros mountains was not the restorative silence of a wound healing, but the hollow stillness of a people who realized that in the eyes of the great powers, their independence was a luxury the world could not afford. The invasion of Iran serves as a poignant reminder that the cost of victory is rarely shared equally. As we reflect on the maps and the convoys, we must also remember the faces of those who stood by the roadside, watching their world be dismantled to save another. The broken promises of 1941 and 1946 echo through the corridors of power even today, a haunting testament to the fact that when empires collide, it is the ground beneath them that suffers most. The bridge has long since been dismantled, but the waters that flow beneath it still run deep with the memory of a sovereignty lost in the name of a greater good that was never truly their own.